Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host. And I don't know why. I'm in a great mood today. I haven't figured out why, but I just am. Our guest today is Steve Ward. Now, actually, he is known as Switchblade on Mack Maloney's show. And that's how I talked to him the first time. And I thought, wow, this guy's really knowledgeable. So I got to get him on my show sometime. And then I got a little nudge from a friend that listens to the show out in San Rafael, California, and said, hey, you ought to have Steve Ward on. And I said, oh, yeah, you reminded me. And next thing you know, Steve is on the show. That was only like a few weeks ago. And he said he was available, and here he is. And before that, I have Alejandro Rojas with the news. Coming up in just a second here, I just want to thank everyone that helps support the show. And for all the people behind the scenes helping out with the show, I appreciate that too. We also have a blogger named Charles Lear. So you can go over to our website. We have a new blog up there. And he's been putting them out about once a week. So check out podcastufo.com. And if anyone wants to support the show, all the information's over there as well. And Alejandro, how are you doing?
I am good. How are you, my friend?
I am doing really good.
You're
really
good. I know
why.
you're in a good mood.
I think
What's up with that?
Yeah, it must be that something like spring is in the air or something.
You need to cut that out.
I know. I can't
Not to make generalities, but is it weird that you're in a good mood because you have a Russian wife and like in Eastern European, it seems like, you know, you're odd if you're happy. Is that true?
I think that is true. You're not supposed to be.
At least, you know, in those areas.
Yeah.
That just makes you feel weird when you're happy, huh?
You can't be happy, no. Then you won't try to figure out a way to get things if you're happy. So, you know, that's what they do.
Interesting. Well, you better cut it out. You're going to get in trouble.
I know. I'm glad she's not listening. She never does, so I'm safe. Yeah. So what's going on in the UFO world?
UFO world. So a lot is going on. Of course, last week we talked a little bit about the AAPC, the Aerial Anomalous Phenomena Conference that was held by the Scientific Coalition for Ufology, the SCU, you know, all of these acronyms. But Billy Cox wrote a story recently. Billy Cox does a blog called The Void. It's for the Sarasota Herald Tribune. And they're kind of tough to find, but of course, you know, all these news stories that I talk about, you can find on the front page of openminds.tv. And this is a great one. The story's called Drilling In. That's why you can never find his stories, because they never have UFO in them. And I'm not sure how he creates the titles. That would be something great to ask him. But he's great. I mean, I love Billy's stuff. So if you're not following the Devoid blog, you really need to. Like he says, he's been doing this for years, and he says he's like the lone, you know, mainstream journalist blogger out there writing about this stuff. And for a while he was. Now there's some more. But he was at that AAPC conference, and he was able to write up a story just the other day about the presentation on the Nimitz event. So, of course, you've had Robert Powell on to talk about some of this, but they have this 270-page report that's coming out, years of investigation. Of course, Robert's been on this. Robert's a member of the SCU, but he's been on this case for years, even before we found out about it in the New York Times. And so they finally released their report. He did this report with Peter Reale. Peter Reale is an engineer who used to work in the Silicon Valley. He's since retired. Now he's interested in this phenomena, but has been looking for a credible place. He thus far has not felt he's found, you know, a credible organization, to be honest, that he would be able to join and do this sort of research. So he's excited about it, and SCU is excited to have him because in this report, they do some really great work. One of the things that Peter focused on is kind of estimating the speeds of the craft. Now, he had to use anecdotal information. They really didn't have any radar, so they just had to say, okay, David Fravor, for instance, the commander, who's a jet pilot. He's a commander, very important person, very capable, credible person. He says he saw the object at this point and then saw it at this point. Or radar caught it, according to radar operators, at this point, and then, you know, at this time it was seen at this point. So using that sort of data, they were able to estimate the ranges of speeds that this thing has gone on, you know, the velocities that these things were traveling at. But even their conservative estimates estimate these things going at least 10,000 miles per hour, experiencing huge G-forces of, anywhere from 15 or 16 up to 300 plus Gs, which of course the G-force is at one, what you're experiencing right now is 1 G, the gravity pulling you from the planet. But when you're traveling fast, you experience, greater G-forces. Now, this is interesting. 8 or 9 Gs is really what about the most that a vehicle can take, let alone a human being. So a human can take that at a few seconds before they'll pass out. So these are extremely fast accelerations that they're talking about. And 8 or 9 Gs is as fast as an F-16 could go before it starts falling apart. So it can't really pull those types of G-forces at a sustainable period of time. Now, to move these masses, something the size of an F-16 or F-18, which is what they're flying, at these, speeds, it would take, they estimated gigawatts, or the equivalent of 2 tons of TNT, or in cases of the equivalent of a nuclear explosion. Why is that important? Because when we see an expenditure of this sort of energy, we see nuclear blasts, or we see, let's take a rocket like the Saturn V or something. You see these huge engines and explosions. That's what a rocket is, a contained explosion.
Right.
So it takes, a huge, it's something that is observable. So if this thing was able to generate and expend the sort of energy that was witnessed by, the witnesses, we don't know how that could be. That's just not possible from how we understand physics. So, some of that's just kind of a little bit of what Billy Cox is getting into when he kind of goes over, what they were doing and what they were looking at in their analysis. Now, the full analysis is going to be coming out in just the next few days, along with witness testimony. So they've talked to a lot of witnesses, and we'll be able to hear audio and see some of these witnesses talking about their experiences. So it's going to be really exciting when that report comes out. But yeah, this Billy Cox article, I really like. I think Billy's great. He's someone to follow. He always does a good job. Their blogs, so often they are humorous. He puts his own humor and perspective in there, and he does a great job with that. So highly recommend people want to check that out.
Have you noticed in the last few weeks, there's been, I think, 2 more witnesses from the Nimitz case that came forward?
Yeah, well, when Robert's report comes out, there'll be even more. So, wow. Yes, there have been. And essentially, if you've been following online, there are these groups. So, for instance, anybody who used to be on the USS Princeton, that was essentially the radar support ship that was supporting the USS Nimitz carrier. And they're the ones who caught the objects on radar. Kevin Day, one of the witnesses, you've had him on, was working on that. They have Facebook groups where they talk about this stuff, or jet fighters keep in touch. So over time, and as this has been getting more attention, it's not so much that they didn't know, but they've been conversing, and more people seem to be feeling comfortable to talk to specific people. And especially as, some of these witnesses like David Fravor or Kevin Day, have good experiences with some of these people. They're able to say, well, definitely I would recommend you talk to these people. Don't talk to them. They kind of creeped me out, or I didn't have a good experience. But here's some people, like they got a little, I think they like talking to you, from what I understand. But, and I can understand that. You're a happy guy, right?
Just today.
At least today.
It's really kind of very strange about this case in general, and I wonder if it's been addressed anywhere, and that is that some people had to sign NDAs and some did not. So, and Kevin Day, who was on the show, it's pretty dramatic what he experienced, and he was not even asked to not talk about it, never mind sign something. I think that's really bizarre.
I think it is. Well, what it harkens back to, for better or worse, depending, what people believe, is just kind of what we've heard over the years from military cases and military witnesses, at least if you're someone who actually talks to these guys and doesn't kind of summarize and make assumption, is that, the military's not prepared for this sort of stuff. There is no, we can hear from these witnesses, and we've heard from these military witnesses across the board for many, many years, this same sort of story, that when something like this happens, everybody feels awkward and uncomfortable. There are people making fun of people, which, some people have gotten really upset about. There's some people yelling at each other. There is no consistent pattern because no one knows how to deal with it. And they don't have really a set of instructions. Even, I think, intelligence officers, they don't know what they're supposed to do. Are they supposed to do something with it? Are they not? So there's these inconsistencies because everybody's dealing with it the way they think they're supposed to or should, or not deal with it. Because, of course, many of these things just get swept under the rug because I think, they're like, well, we'll get made fun of. I don't really have any instructions on how to deal with this, so I'm not going to deal with this. I'm going to sweep this under the rug. That's the most common thing we hear from military witnesses. Everybody else just didn't pay attention, or they told me to sweep it under the rug. So I think that, all of these inconsistencies and everything that we see and all of these difficulties these witnesses had, it's kind of nice. Now they almost have this support group like they've never had before, which is making them more comfortable to come out and speak, I think. But we see, just the confusion, the confusion. Nobody knows what to do with it. Even though what's very, very interesting is these guys are all very convinced that, what they experienced was something unusual, something that was not ours, and it makes them think, what else is going on out there? And what's going to be great is this History Channel show when it comes up. Now, I don't think, people, when Lou Elizondo, let's say, says, I've got more UFO disclosure to share with you all, I'm trying to get more, and we'll have more in the History Channel show. A lot of people in the UFO community are like, oh, he's finally going to show us the aliens or tell us what happened at Roswell. No, what they're talking about is this sort of data that they've achieved. To us or to some people, an alien body is what's exciting. To these guys, it's exciting that they had experiences with technology beyond our own, and that is extremely important. That's the type of data and information we're going to see. And from what I understand, we're going to have more information about Tic Tacs, that other people saw these same craft, and we're going to hear from that. And especially, and some of these witnesses have talked about it, these occurrences where there were multiple objects, very, very many of them. So I think we're going to hear some really incredible stories and hear from witnesses related to those incredible cases when this History Channel show arrives. Now, you may be like, well, I've heard about, UFOs and jets chasing UFOs. That's not exciting to me. Well, that's exciting to a lot of people and to the mainstream, especially witnesses. So don't expect, that they're going to be like carting out an alien body and saying, look, here's Joe. We've been working with Joe for 20 years. He's an alien from Zeta Reticuli. That's not the type of thing they're talking about. They're talking about, credible witnesses, discussing their credible experiences, and hopefully some hard data like some radar information or some analysis of materials. Yeah,
even that alone, analysis of material that can't be explained, that's exciting enough. Not that it's any, solid evidence that it was created by extraterrestrial intelligence, but still, it's fascinating anyway.
Yeah, it's a conversation at another level where these are a group of people that can challenge mainstream science. If they come out and say, hey, this is what we found, we believe it's anomalous. Now mainstream science, it's kind of incumbent upon them to answer them, whereas the lowly UFO researcher out there who may be able to have raised some funds to have an analysis done isn't really going to get that attention. Nobody's going to really care to address their claims. But, we've got this whole thing's been brought to a new level that makes this all very exciting.
Yeah, excellent. All right, Alejandro, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay, and we'll see you next week, right?
See you next week.
All right. Thank you, and talk to you later. Yeah, bye-bye. All right, everyone, our guest, Steve Ward, a.k.a. Switchblade over at Mack Maloney's show, Military X-Files over there. We've done some in-studio shows there, and I got to talk to Steve. And he grew up in Michigan, and he was there during the flap back in 1966. that sparked his interest. And then not too far away from there was the Mothman. So we might get a little off the UFO topic here and there tonight, but we'll still have a good conversation. Welcome to the show, Steve.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So how did Mack find you anyway? Are you just someone that called into the show once, or how did that happen?
No, I was a fan of his Wingman books for a long time.
Oh, I see.
And I even wrote Mack a fan letter eons ago, way before the radio gigs, and I actually got a response. But we were connected on Facebook, and I think what happened was I attend the Mothman Festival and I post a lot of stuff about the Mothman and paranormal in general. I think Mack must have seen that. I invited him to the Mothman Festival one time, the way you can invite people to various festivals and so forth. Mm-hmm. And he must have seen my posts on the Mothman, because one time he just asked me if I would come on and talk about John Keel and the Mothman Prophecies. And we did that. We did a couple segments, and then he started to have me come back as a correspondent, and we've been doing it for about 3 years now.
Yeah. He's a fun guy, isn't he?
Oh yeah, the show's a blast too.
Right. Yeah, with his little sidekicks going there. So can you just go ahead and give your overall background, if you would, and and I know you went and you actually met Ray Stanford, who calls in the show quite often and has been on the show a number of times as well. But you also met J. Allen Hynek, and back in 1976 at MUFON event, was it? Something like that?
Yeah, it was the MUFON Symposium for 1976, and they held it in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And the reason they did was because they were looking back 10 years before. It was March of 1966 when the wave of sightings and landings took place they're kind of in my backyard, in Ann Arbor, Michigan, Dexter, Hillsdale. And that was the time when Dr. Hynek, he was still attached to Project Blue Book, but he was soon to leave Blue Book and start the Center for UFO Studies in Evanston, Illinois. But that was the time when he uttered the famous phrase that some of these sightings might be swamp gas. And of course, That's all the press needed to hear, and that solved the UFO mystery for all time. And those are some sightings in Hillsdale, Michigan, in a swampy area. And he didn't believe, he thought it was possible that some of them may be swamp gas, but he had come to believe that there was something much more to this. He was a colleague of Dr. Jacques Vallee by this time as well. Mm-hmm. Who was the computer scientist and mathematician that came over from France. And but anyway, in 1976 in Ann Arbor, the name of his talk, it was great because it was called Swamp Gas Plus 10 and Counting. So he recounted those days and the chaos and the fiasco. He had some great cartoons of the time, like one where you see the little green man. They've landed in their saucer. They've got these horrible looking ray guns and everything, and they've stopped an Earthman on the street, and they say, "Take us to the one that called us swamp gas." So he had quite a bit of fun with it. Yeah. And by then, like I say, he had started the Center for UFO Studies, a very prestigious outfit, and it was great, to see him. Ray Stanford was talking about his project back then called Starlight International, where he kind of made his own, like a UFO landing port. And I thought it was kind of silly, but he was getting great photographs of anomalous objects in the sky. I think this is in Texas somewhere, as I recall. Yeah. And I even met in the lobby. I met Gray Barker, the infamous Gray Barker of Saucerian Publications. Of course, he was far too controversial to speak at a MUFON Symposium, but I actually kind of cornered him and did a kind of a mini interview because it was like my chance to talk to Gray Barker.
Wow. And it was it 1966 the flap that took place back then that got you interested in the beginning?
March of 1966, yes. Uh-huh. And a lot of credible sightings. I mean, a lot of police officers were saying these things. There was a landing on the Frank Manor farm in Dexter, and a lot of people witnessed that. So, and of course, the the news media reported on it. They were always a little bit tongue in cheek, but I was only in junior high at the time, so I couldn't play UFO investigator. But it was a pretty exciting time.
Yeah. And how long did that flap last?
I think it lasted a few months. Now it wasn't just restricted to that area. It was all over the Midwest. And if I recall correctly, there was another one that came up again in a couple more years. But that was around the time of I don't know if you remember the Dale Spar sighting, the police officer that chased the object across northern Ohio. And the Blue Book got a hold of him, the Air Force, and they made him look like a fool. Oh. It was really bad. He actually saw this thing take off, and they told him that he chased the planet Venus. So that was it. Really ruined his life at the time. I don't know if he ever recovered, but a lot of things are going on. Like I say, a lot of very credible people were seeing these things, and this is more in the way of landings and so forth. This was. They weren't talking too much about abductions at that time. That was the Betty and Barney Hill incident is probably the thing that really triggered that. Of course, these things have been going on for a long time, just hadn't been reported.
I guess at the SCU conference they had recently in Alabama, there was someone talking there about time and high-speed travel and all that, and he said his theory was that on these flaps, even though they may happen a couple of days apart, it could be up to 50 years apart for the passengers if there's any in the vehicle, which is another mind bender, to add to the whole speculation of.
Well, it's true. We really, the bottom line is we really don't know what the heck is going on.
Right.
I think we have made some progress, but there's another thing to consider. I've heard people over the years say that, well, we don't hear much about UFOs these days. They must have either all gone back to their home planet or people have suddenly regained their mental health or something. But I don't know if you were familiar with there was a great resource that isn't there anymore, but it was called the UFO News Clipping Service. And it was published every month. I think Lucius Farish out of Arkansas, I think, was the first one to publish it. Anyway, for $5 a month, he would he subscribed to all kinds of clipping services. So he would gather all these UFO reports from predominantly the U.S. but also all over the world, and he even had a Forteana section. And what you would find out if you subscribe to that while early on, the mainstream media did cover some of these things, and they do occasionally. I mean, we had Betty and Barney Hill, we had the Pascagoula incident, we had the Coyne helicopter incident, and O'Hare, and more recently in Stevensville. But there's these huge gaps in between. But if you were to subscribe to this clipping service, you would find out that these reports are going on all the time, but they usually don't get any further than their local newspaper. Very, very seldom do the wire services pick it up. Mm-hmm. So the activity has never really stopped.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. Now it's you can put a Google alert on to do basically the same thing as a clipping service, right?
Yes, I would think so. I don't know how much. Yeah, I guess a lot of that would be cataloged and being able to find on the internet. Yeah,
on the internet only, and I'm not talking about newspapers. And I wonder if that still happens. I wonder if there's still local newspapers, in different regions that report a UFO and it never goes anywhere online. I wonder if that happens.
And how many people still don't? I'm not sure that I would report something to any agency. I don't need the grief. I mean, I might go to who's the gentleman? Peter Davenport.
Davenport.
Yes. I might go to him, but I certainly wouldn't call my local news and tell them that I'd seen something in the sky.
Well, why? Because you think that you get hassled, basically?
Well, yeah, I think that it won't go anywhere. It won't hit a database that means anything. Mm-hmm. But a few months ago, my car broke down, and so I've got I've got a couple of Mothman stickers on my bumper. I'm afraid I'm that kind of guy. Well, the tow truck guy pulls up and he looks at that and he reads them and he says, well, I had some experiences. So we're driving back and he tells me he was in the military. He was in a base, I think, in Alabama. He and his friend were out on a patrol. They saw a strange-looking cryptid on all fours, hairless, cut right in front of their car and run into the woods. And they went in so far. His buddy stayed in the car. He went into the woods a little bit, but thought, no, I'm not going any further. Then he told me about a couple other paranormal experiences he had. So I get back to the dealer, the guy that has fixed my car before, and he's seen the T-shirts I wear. So everybody knows that I'm one of those guys. And then he says to me, he says, did I ever tell you about the UFO I saw? It was north of Detroit, out in the country. And he tells me about this classic flying saucer UFO. He sees it on a 2-lane out in the middle of nowhere, and they whip around to try and get another look at it, and it's gone. 2 weeks later, I'm at my dentist, and my dentist says, "What are you doing this summer?" And I said, "Well, I'm speaking here and there on the weird stuff, UFOs and Bigfoot." He said, "Well, I saw a UFO up north once," and he tells me his story. So it's like, so many people have had. Have you ever been at a dinner party or at a restaurant? People start talking about hauntings.
Yeah.
A lot of people have some kind of an experience. It's very much like so many people. Now, I'm not much of an experiencer, unfortunately, but so many people have these experiences, and they just kind of keep them close to the vest because of the ridicule factor.
Unless someone else talks about it.
And the giggle factor.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Hey, we're ready to go into break. So
Okay.
hang in there, everyone. We'll be right back right after these messages. All right, welcome back to the show. My guest tonight is Steve Ward from Michigan, I didn't ask him if he lives there now, but that's where he grew up. We were just before the break, we were talking about how things happen at dinner parties. And Steve, I have to say, I agree. There's so many times that I've either worn a UFO T-shirt or something, and someone will stare at it, then turn away, and then get in a conversation, and next thing you know, they're telling me about this amazing UFO story. It's really, like you said, people hold it close to the vest. A lot of people, and in the chat, I was looking in just during our break here, and someone posted on there that about 90% of the people do not report, and I agree. I think that number's fairly close, one way or the other.
Yeah, isn't it interesting the way so many people have a wide variety of experiences that we could put under the broad blanket of the paranormal, but just don't talk about it. And, we're used to seeing, if it ever comes up on the news, a lot of times they'll save it for the very end, and they'll put it in a tongue-in-cheek way, and they giggle about it a little bit. Right. And I've always wondered what it says about the psychology of the mainstream media. They just don't want to deal with it. And I think some of those people have probably had their own experiences, but God forbid they ever admit it to a colleague or talk about it on the air.
Right. Well, I think it's a little more. I think it's changed a little bit within just the last year. It just seems like there's a easing of that tension that comes up when people are talking about in public. About UFO sightings. And
I think you're right.
Yeah. And George Knapp has for years just done it. He's had the courage and to just go ahead and talk UFOs with on TV, and he still has a job. And
but it's because of him we've got to help get the story out about the so-called Skinwalker Ranch, which is another one of these areas where all kinds of different phenomena seems to occur.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story. I'm attempting to get George on. I've tried to get him on this show for a number of years, and think I'm going to be able to do that, but it's just going to have to be at a different time that the show will be live. That's all. Like a pre-recorded show for a podcast or for KGRA radio and other radio stations, Dark Matter Digital Network, all that. So anyway, I hope to get George on, and that's one of the main topics I want to talk to him about is the Skinwalker I read that book. I'm not sure if you've read it. It's fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's one of your fascinations in this, places like Skinwalker. You want to talk a little bit about some?
Yes. Well, we talked a little bit about the March 1966. Well, the following November, that's when the first, not the first, but the big major sighting of the so-called Mothman took place. November 15th, 1966, Point Pleasant, West Virginia, right on near the Ohio River. And Point Pleasant is another area where people were seeing all kinds of strange lights in the sky. They were experiencing poltergeist phenomena, and they were seeing this weird creature, whatever it was. The Skinwalker Ranch, sort of a three-ring circus of the paranormal. They had cattle mutilations, giant triangles passing overhead, creatures seen in the night. They supposedly Robert Bigelow owned the ranch for a while, and
Right. Long while.
I just got a notice on my computer that they wanted to restart it. So I said, no, not now. Not a good time to restart my computer. Okay. But yes, they had a scientific team there, the National Institute for Discovery Science. And the interesting thing there was that Colin Kelleher, who co-wrote the book with George Knapp, I think he said that they cataloged about 200 separate events of paranormal activity, from orbs to UFOs to animal mutilations, whatever, and nothing was repeated. So how do you apply the scientific method to something like that?
Right.
But
Amazing.
to me, it seems like when you look at these areas, there has to be a reason. Now John Keel, of course, the author of the Mothman Prophecies, he wrote a book earlier called Strange Creatures from Time and Space, and that's where he first introduced the idea of windows and window areas, because he was trying to come to grips with the reason that it seems like a lot of these things, Bigfoot, even UFO flaps, they sort of pop in and pop out, almost as if they're coming from somewhere else or manifesting from somewhere else and then dissipating or disappearing. Now, he was kind of vague. It was later on when he wrote UFOs Operation Trojan Horse that he got into some of his ideas about what might be going on. And I have to say, I really resisted that book when it came out, because I was very happy with the straight ET hypothesis. The saucer lands, the little silver-suited being jumps out, takes a soil sample, and it takes off. Sometimes they would pick up somebody for an unscheduled medical exam or whatever. But that the framework was ET. But he thought that he began to think that the facade, that what you were looking at may not be that important. He thought there may be a cosmic mechanism behind it. And he borrowed a term from, the researcher Ivan Sanderson, who was known for writing the book, The Abominable Snowman, Legend Come to Life. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And he wrote some great books on UFOs and the Bermuda Triangle and so forth. And he used a term called ultra-terrestrial. So Keel borrowed that, and what he meant by that, he said he used it as a literary device, and he said that he thought that perhaps we were looking in the wrong place to look at the ET hypothesis, and he talked about now here's one of my favorite words, that these were transmogrifications of energy. And that there was some force or intelligence or something that would transmogrify into these different shapes, UFOs and Bigfoot and so forth. He thought the phenomena may be somewhat reflective, and reflecting back what our expectations were. And if you follow the manifestation, the sort of history of the UFOs and strange lights in the sky, you had in ancient times, the Chinese called them dragon tracks. In another time period, if you saw a strange light going through the sky, well, of course, that was a witch carrying her lantern on a broom. And then you had the Foo Fighters and so forth. He thought that the only thing that may be real were the lights themselves, and that the facade, or he didn't say they didn't think they were illusions because they were taking some kind of at least temporal physicality. But so anyway, now he didn't. As time went on, he didn't actually completely close the door to the ET hypothesis. He just didn't think that it explained everything, and I still tend to agree with that. I think we're dealing with much more than one thing, one answer. In other words.
Yes, kind of like Jacques Vallee. I guess that's kind of along the lines of his thinking, too. And you're probably right. It is fascinating when things appear, and then just like you said, vanish. And it's not always some people that are talking about a sighting, a UFO sighting in particular. They don't always say that it took off. Sometimes they say it just vanished, and that makes you think interdimensional. What the heck, or what is it? How is that here and then it's not here? And
you mentioned.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh, okay. The high strangeness areas. We talk about the Skinwalker Ranch. I think Ted Phillips was investigating a place in Missouri he called Marley Woods, the Bridgewater Triangle, the Bradshaw Ranch near Sedona, and so forth. But if you go back to 1897, remember the reports of the airship flap. These huge, majestic, dirigible-like craft that were seen all over the U.S. and other parts of the world. And there was one in a series of sightings in Ohio, 1897. And I think this was, if I remember, about mid-April to mid-May. And it was these sightings were kind of making a clockwise circle around Ohio and even overlapping into West Virginia a little bit. Well, on the ground in Adams County, where the Serpent Mound is, people were seeing something they described as a gorilla or wild man. It's a Bigfoot they're talking about. They also were seeing in an area not too far away these large black cats, which was kind of odd looking. It had kind of a large head and I think short legs. And so it just reminded me of, Stan Gordon did the research has done the research in Pennsylvania for years. And in 73 and 74, he covered a wide flap of strange UFO sightings, as well as Bigfoot-type creatures in the same vicinity. So, who knows what's going on or how they might really be connected. I'm not sure it may be too simple to say that, well, the aliens are dropping off Bigfoot somehow. I don't think that it really explains it. But these things have been going on for a long time. We can find instances where all these different types of phenomena congregate in the same place and time.
Yeah. Have you ever heard of Paul Eno?
Oh yes.
Yeah. He has kind of a theory about this as well. It's pretty interesting. There's a relationship between everything, which is, another theory. I mean, that's all they are, is theories and thoughts. Basically we're actually clueless.
Well, yes, and to say there's one thing you'll never hear me say, that I'm an expert.
Yeah,
that's not going to happen.
Yeah. But some people might call themselves that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. No, it's just a fascinating topic in general, and so as far as you started to get into, I think just before the break, you started to get into Mothman, or it might have been just a few minutes ago. I can't remember exactly, but. So did you follow that case and what was happening and all that?
Yes. Of course, it came over the wire services and went all over the world. That first sighting chased two couples down Route 62, and I followed John Keel because he would occasionally write about the Mothman, and he was really the only one that knew that much about it to report it. The Mothman was a paradox. It was about 7 feet tall, dark in color. The red glowing eyes didn't seem to be eye shine. It seemed to be generating its own light. The wingspan was about 10 feet, which probably isn't quite big enough to actually carry a body that tall.
Mm-hmm.
People would see it take off like a helicopter and not flap its wings. There were even some close sightings that Keel talked about in some lectures where people thought they heard some kind of a machinery or humming coming from it. There's so many things that didn't make any sense. It didn't make sense as a flesh and blood creature. It doesn't necessarily, it's more like an apparition, but it doesn't make sense there either. And then you had all the strange UFO sightings in connection with it. And of course, it culminated with the bridge collapse, which a lot of people think it caused directly or foretold. And I don't think so. I don't know that it was a harbinger, but it's just one of those things where, John Keel never solved the mystery. People asked him, what was the Mothman? They figured he's the expert, he should know, and he couldn't tell people what really happened there.
Again, the expert, yeah.
Yes.
I had never heard that there was actually UFO sightings during that time as well.
Oh, yes, they were just in fact, Keel saw it. There were so many of them. He would go out with Mary Heyer, who was a local reporter there. And they actually, there was the TNT area, which is north of Point Pleasant. They called it the TNT area because it was a munitions area during World War II. It was a huge complex. In fact, during the Mothman Festival, I'm one of the tour guides in the dreaded TNT area where they first saw the Mothman. And a couple of friends of mine, John and Tim Frick, fly the Mothman over a certain part of the ride. So you're guaranteed at least to see the Mothman. It's a lot of fun. But that was the area where this first major sighting took place. But it was crowded. When people thought the Mothman was out there, there were hundreds of people out there with loaded guns and good Lord. So John Keel and Mary Heyer and some other people would go down south of there, down to a place called Gallipolis Ferry, and out in the middle of nowhere. And it was a good observation point because they saw all kinds of strange lights go over. Keel even saw a really close-up sighting of a landing one time of a very bright object. But that's not the only thing they saw. There was one night he saw these. They were kind of like purple lights or blobs or whatever up in the sky, and they even came down and they circled him, almost like there was some kind of a living creature or something like that. There are people that believe that one aspect of the UFO phenomena is that we are actually dealing with some kind of living being or whatever that just naturally exists in the sky. But there were so many different things that happened there. He was in contact with several different people. And there were things going on back in Long Island as well, where he lived in that area, and all over the Ohio Valley. He was in contact with several people that firmly believed that they were in contact with some other intelligence. And he called them the silent contactees because they firmly believed what was going on was real, and they had no interest at all in any publicity or trying to convince anybody what was happening. So they would be, a lot of it was sort of like channeling, where they were getting these messages and so forth. They weren't necessarily, seeing a physical being and, shaking hands with them. But the Mothman Prophecies is really a fascinating book. And, Brent Rains is writing a book on John Keel that should be out this spring sometime. Brent knew John for many years, and it'll deal a lot with it. John Keel's early life was fascinating, too. He was really a really interesting guy. But he's forgot where I was going with that. But I guess, yes, the Mothman book. The people should know that the Mothman Prophecies, that the editors cut half of it out before they published it. They edited it down. Now, some of that was saved in the Eighth Tower, about 2/3 of it. But John Keel told Brent Rains when some years ago, he said, if I had told everything that happened in that during that time period, it would have easily filled 6 books. And there's something else some people should know. There are 2 other books out now called The Big Blackout and The Big Breakthrough by John Keel. And what those are some resurrected notes that he took during that time period. Some of those notes became parts of the Mothman Prophecies, but you get a lot more detail. You get into his thinking, and he's interviewing people, and he's questioning, is this person credible? Can I believe what they're saying? So it's they're really great supplements to the Mothman Prophecies.
Have you followed what has been purported to be happening in Chicago regarding the Mothman sightings fairly
Not
recently?
too much.
Yeah.
I've heard some talks on it. Some of those reports seem to be ringers. Some of them, I know a researcher that went and visited some of those spots, and some of the areas, are the descriptions given don't match up. So I think there's a few ringers in there. But on the other hand, she said, this is Alison Jornlin, she said that she's found other witnesses that are very credible. Now, I don't know how it breaks down, but I'm also cautious when people say, any kind of a winged creature, they want to call it the Mothman. Well, I'd be hesitant about that. I'm not sure that these, I don't know what to call them, paranormal entities are that easily cataloged. If you go back to, I think, around World War I, people were seeing some kind of a large birdman in the Ohio Valley along the Elk River, Kanawha River, that they all kind of empty into the Ohio. They were about a 10-foot wingspan, human-like head, and they were freaking people out at the time. There was a sighting about 3 years before the big Mothman sighting in Kent, England, where this thing looked very much like the Mothman, very similar. But some kids coming back from a dance in Kent, they saw some kind of a strange light land behind a group of woods, and then out from it came this shuffling thing it sounded like a precursor to the Mothman. So I'm just very, very cautious. And then Linda Godfrey, who's done great research into the Dogman phenomena. She she covered the so-called Wisconsin man bat of a few years ago, and that thing was very different. So there's all kinds of winged. In fact, I wrote a chapter for Timothy Green Beckley, edited a book called Weird Winged Wonders, and in there I have a chapter on the Mothman, Point Pleasant, and the Mothman Festival. There's some other great contributions in there by, I believe, Paul Eno's in there, and Brad Steiger, one of the last things he contributed, and it covers all kinds of winged entities, creatures, and so forth, and the variety is amazing.
Yeah. Well, that whole cryptid thing is pretty strange, too, and elusive, and you it's just another one of those things you can't just say there's nothing to it. You really have to.
And they do,
yeah.
And there does seem to be a connection, at least in some cases, to the UFO phenomena.
Yeah. Well, we're right at the break again, and so we're going to take a break, and we'll be back right after these messages. Hang in there. All right, welcome back. This is Martin Willis and Podcast UFO, and my guest this evening is Steve Ward, and we've been talking about all kinds of strange things, Mothman and more, not just UFOs, but we're going to be talking about patterns, and why don't you go ahead and I know you said your main focus is the patterns found in paranormal and high strangeness areas. So let's talk more about that. We touched on it a little bit, but let's go into that some more.
Right, because I think these things, the not only the high strangeness areas, but these possible links. Now, you can't be dogmatic about these things, obviously, because again, we're in a really unknown territory. But there are patterns that seem to show up. Now, for example, we can probably cite hundreds of cases where UFOs come in close proximity to a vehicle and the engine stalls. And we assume that remember the classic scene in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where Richard Dreyfuss's truck gets stopped by a UFO. And of course, they overdo it there. The mailboxes are going all over the place. But you can find all kinds of instances like this in the literature. Well, I thought, where else can you find vehicle stoppages? Well, 1960, North Cumberland, England. A lady named Dorothy Strong is in a taxi cab, and they're going along, and all of a sudden, they're seeing essentially a phantom army start to manifest, a huge army. Now, as it comes close to them, the soldiers fade out. And this is not the first time this has happened. So they know what this is. It's from 1388, the Battle of Otterburn. And so, but the thing is that as it's coming close to the vehicle, the taxi cab stalls, the fare meter goes crazy, and they feel like they're being hit by an invisible wall. Now these things, phantom armies are not uncommon. I mean, they happen, and not just in England, but Gettysburg, the same thing happens. But now you wonder, in hauntings and so forth, people will have their batteries drained when something manifests. So perhaps something of this magnitude could stop a car, but it fades out very quickly, and then the taxi cab starts again, no problem. Okay, let's go a step stranger. Let's see, 1960. Near Marlington, West Virginia, two-lane highway. W.T. Doc Priestley, he's cruising down this two-lane. In front of him is a bus full of his buddies. They're going caravan style somewhere. All of a sudden, his car stops and cruises to us. Which has been running fine. The engine stalls and it goes to a stop. He looks over to his left and sees a classic Bigfoot standing by the road. Now, this thing, it seems like it's crazy. That's like that when its hair starts to stand up on end a little bit, it is affecting his engine. Now, his buddies see that he's not behind him anymore. The bus turns around, they're coming back, and Mr. Bigfoot recedes back into the woods. He's able to start his car again. At that time, he does not tell his buddies, hey, guess what I saw? He didn't want to deal with it right then. So they take off, and very shortly afterwards, his car starts to stall again. He sees sparks underneath the engine, and there's Mr. Bigfoot again, either the same Bigfoot or his kissing cousin standing there. So later on, he gives a interview to the press about the strange thing that happened. Now, there are a few cases on record like that where the close proximity of a cryptid seems like it might have some kind of effect on the engine. But my all-time favorite vehicle stoppage, and this gets into, you mentioned Jacques Vallee earlier, and there's a lot we can talk about him because he really showed the connection between folklore, elements of folklore like Celtic folklore and so forth, the fairies, the little people and so forth, and some modern day UFO experiences. There are undeniable connections like missing time and that sort of thing. But this particular case took place, it was reported by Elliot O'Donnell. Elliot O'Donnell was a kind of a paranormal researcher of his time. He wrote books in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and a book called Ghostland. He talks about an uncle by marriage who had a bizarre experience in Ireland going toward Limerick on a haunted road. His uncle, they just gave him his name as Mr. B. Well, he's in his buggy or cart or whatever it is, being driven by his servant named Dunkley. Now, you don't get a better name than Dunkley for a servant. Okay, so they're going along. It's night, clear skies and everything, and all of a sudden the cart comes to a stop. And he turns around, Mr. B turns around, sees the horse is stopped and is shivering. His servant is in a stupor. He has got a look of terror on his face, and he can't function. Now, and then he looks down, and he sees these little shadowy forms swarming around the cart. And so he doesn't know what's going on, but he turns around, grabs the reins, gets the horse moving again, and breaks the spell. So as he gets away, the servant comes out of it, and he asks him, what happened? What did you see? From his mind's eye, they came upon a troop of dancing fairies making merry. Now, that's a bad news. They don't like people seeing them like this. And from his viewpoint, he could see the anger on their faces. They're ascending on the cart, and they're literally trying to pull him off. So these two people experienced something. Again, if this is a true story, we have to put in that caveat, but they've experienced something different. If you're going to make up a story, I don't think you're going to create this duality here, like we saw something different. But it struck me as, this is another vehicle stoppage, may not be connected to the other ones at all. But if you think about some of the classic abduction cases, Betty and Barney Hill. There's some similarities, at least in the beginning. They're going along in the car stops, they're ushered out of the car by these 5-foot-tall beings, not exactly the fairies, I would say, but Barney is in kind of a stupor a good part of the time. He's not conscious all the time. Betty is alive and alert and a real spitfire and giving the aliens a rough time. And also, while they reported very much the same experience, they didn't actually report exactly the same experience. The faces, one of them reported that they had kind of Jimmy Durante noses. The other one said they were more like slits. So the experience wasn't quite identical. And then if you look briefly at the Pascagoula incident, Hickson and Parker, the Pascagoula fishermen that were abducted off the pier in 1973, Parker goes out. He's unconscious. And Hickson stays alert. And think how many instances of paranormal, of UFO abductions, where the spouse knows what's going on and sees the graves or whatever, but their spouse is unconscious, asleep, and they can't wake them up. So again, I don't know that these are patterns are real or not, but it's just very interesting to follow them through.
Well, just one thing. I've had Calvin Parker on this show, and by the way, he's doing really well these days. He's getting involved in all kinds of things, which is great. After he came, and started speaking again, actually. But one thing,
I was really glad to see him come forward finally.
Yeah, but one thing he did say was the story about him being passed out was something he made up because he didn't want to talk about it.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good to know.
Yeah.
I don't blame him. Yeah. But anyway, so there are these parallels with other situations anyway.
Yeah, right.
But there's something. I do have a kind of a personal story about Hickson and Parker, because back when we had our informal UFO group, our sort of de facto leader, Lloyd, he knew, Menendez that co-wrote the book with Charles Hickson, the Pascagoula incident?
Yeah.
Well, this is back in the middle 70s. We got a hold of a cassette copy of that. You heard about when Hickson and Parker went to the sheriff.
Right.
And the sheriff went out of the sheriff went out of the room and recorded these guys, and they didn't know they were being recorded. We heard that back in the middle 70s, years before anybody else did. And so we knew back then that these guys were legitimate and that something really bizarre happened to them.
Yeah, that's a great case. Yeah, it was Mendez, actually. Yes.
Mendez. Yep. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's all kinds of other. There's the classic, the connection between folklore and modern day UFO experiences are fascinating, and we could go on forever. But one of the really classic cases took place in '61 in Eagle River, Wisconsin, and that was the Joe Symington incident. And I call them the cosmic pancakes from outer space. I don't know if people remember this case, but Symington was a plumber by trade and a chicken farmer by day, and his farm's kind of isolated, and he sees this craft land, pretty standard, flying saucer type craft. And it has come down, and there's a door open. He approaches it, and he looks inside, and he's pretty non-threatening. He sees these men in there in coveralls. They look like they might be about 5 feet tall. And this is the case where they hand him a kind of a silver chalice and indicate through sign language that they want water in it. Now you wonder, what the heck do ETs, if that's what they are, want with water? So he goes to his well, and he brings back the water, and he notices that one of them is cooking on a flameless grill.
Oh, I know
something
this
that looked like
something
that looked like pancakes.
Right.
And so they give him some of these pancakes, supposedly in exchange for the water. And the incident doesn't last very long, and they take off. The thing is, you can hear Joe Symington tell this story on YouTube. Some of these old clippings, all these brief interviews that were done. And the thing is that Dr. Hynek got in on this. This is back when he was still in Blue Book, and everybody, the officers that interviewed him, there was a Judge Carter, I think his name was, that knew him and that interviewed him and wrote an article about it. Everybody said that they don't know what happened there, but Joe believes that this happened. Of course, the Air Force said he had a waking dream or whatever. But there's a lot of, if you follow this, there's a lot of really interesting patterns here. The judge, for one thing, Judge Carter, by the way, we'll get to tell you the punchline of this in a minute. The Air Force actually did check out the ingredients in the pancakes using our taxpayers' money. But we'll get to that in a second. So Judge Carter, who knows Joe and figures he's a credible guy, and Judge Carter was even had investigated UFOs to some degree, and he said, "Well, Joe, what did these guys look like? Little green men?" And Joe says, "Well, no, they look kind of swarthy, like Italians." Yeah. And so, okay, now here's another segue. John Keel found an old. It was some kind of a press conference. General Spatz from World War II. It took place in 1948. I don't know what the whole gist of the conference was, but in part of it he says there's no truth to the rumor that Spaniards are driving flying saucers or that UFOs come from Spain. So now Keel had found in some of his own research some of the now, this is before the Greys came in. That's a whole other subject. There used to be a time when you could almost never find a Grey described in conjunction with a UFO. We had quite a variety of aliens or whatever they are. But Keel found that people were reporting some of the occupants of landed craft as not terribly sophisticated, but they would call them they looked like dark Mediterranean types or foreigners or whatever. So this swarthy looking Italians kind of fit that a bit. And even when you get into some of the Men in Black phenomena, some of the Men in Black actually kind of fit that description, which is kind of interesting. So the whole thing's absurd. I mean, there is a huge absurd factor in so many of these cases, and that's why some people don't deal with them. I mean, if this craft has come down from a mothership, what the heck are they doing looking for an external source of water? And cooking pancakes on it. Don't they have freeze-dried food? Remember the commercials for the astronauts with Tang? Don't they have little packets? I mean, what the heck is going on there? It's crazy.
Sounds like a camping trip to me. Yeah.
Well, yes, but there's this absurd factor. But if you look at the possible fairy connection, and Jacques Vallee pointed this out, when they did the investigation as to what the ingredients were in the pancakes, the one thing that was missing is the one thing that is supposed to be detrimental or deadly to the fairies or the little people, and that was salt. There was no salt in the pancakes. But let's look at just briefly at the water connection. Okay, there's all kinds of instances where craft gather up water. Ingo Swann, who supposedly remote viewed the far side of the moon for a clandestine government group. Ingo Swann was the guy that helped the military develop the remote viewing program. Mm-hmm. So he describes an incident in his book that they went out to this remote location. He didn't know where they were taking him, this government faction or whatever, and they saw this triangular craft come over a lake and literally suck up the water into it. Okay, there's a classic case in Ontario from the 60s where a couple hear this loud noise. They go over and look over this rise, look down in the lake. There's a classic flying saucer UFO landed on the lake. There's a hose in the lake that's apparently drawing water out of the lake. But then we'll go one more. Mid 50s. I can't remember the names. John Black was one of them. A couple of miners. They're out in the middle of nowhere in California. A couple of times over the last month, they've seen one of these classic discs, flying saucers. And then the guy, John, is in the woods, and he sees what he first thinks is a kid bending over a stream fishing. Looks a little closer, and this ain't no kid. Now, this entity is a little short dude, not exactly a gray. It looks like he's wearing a tie, some kind of an outfit, but he's gathering up water in some kind of a bucket or whatever. And then he follows them out of the woods, and he goes to one of these landed craft, goes up the ladder, and takes off. What the heck is going on with entities, if that's what this is, gathering up water in a very conventional manner? Wouldn't you think that they could go to Acme, Cosmic, I don't know, Industrial Hose, whatever? And so anyway, you look at these, you get these crazy patterns, and sometimes these are people that know nothing about the literature or whatever, and don't really have enough information to provide a hoax. But so it's just fascinating to see the way that works. And that just makes me hesitant to say that we're simply dealing with, people from outer space.
Right. I know there's also a case of a woman looking out her window from a cottage in a lake, and a UFO like sucking water out of the lake. I remember reading something about that. I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. So
there's a lot of that.
Yeah, interesting. There's a question that came in the chat that's related to water anyway, and that is there a link, this is a question to you, is there a link between locations close to rivers and possible portal openings or residual sightings, etc.?
Possibly. This actually gets into the David Paulides missing 411 stuff. I don't know if you're familiar with Joshua Kuchin. He wrote a book recently called Thieves in the Night, and he talks very, very much about, he kind of picks up the mantle from Jacques Vallee and talks a great deal about the fairy UFO connection. But he also brings in the David Paulides missing 411 stuff. And for those that don't know what I'm talking about, David Paulides has written, over half a dozen books now on these really, really mysterious disappearances. We're not talking things that are just easily explained. And he's found that there are certain patterns that show up. I mean, people will be out in the wilderness picking berries or in boulder fields. But the thing is, without getting too detailed, Kuchin found out that some of the patterns are very much the same. The people that the folklore that even comes over from the old country, like Newfoundland, and so for example, the things you're told about what to be wary of with encounters with the fairies are some of the same patterns that are found in the missing 411 stuff. I don't know if you know about how sometimes dogs can't track.
Yes.
Right. Well, the dogs were afraid of the fairies. They're like I say, there's a classic case in Newfoundland where a young boy. Now you see, you're supposed to, when you're out picking berries, you were supposed to bring bread with you. Now I don't know if that was if the bread had salt in it. I don't know what the reason was, but I think it was some way it was to ward off the fairies. Well, this one young boy forgot to bring the bread. Well, he disappears. He vanishes for 3 days. He shows up. He's in a stupor. He can't remember what happened to him. Now, I don't know what happened to him, but it sounds exactly like a textbook case of one of the things that David Paulides talks about with some missing people that come back and seem to be unscathed and can't really talk about what happened to them. So there's all kinds. Have you ever heard of mane braiding, like horse mane braiding? There are people, there are Bigfoot researchers that firmly believe that Bigfoot, there's Lisa Scheel who's written a book, Backyard Bigfoot, and there's others. I talked to Bigfoot researchers and they say, oh yes, they believe that Bigfoot comes into remote areas and will braid, sort of cross over the hairs of the horses. Well, that same tradition holds up in Newfoundland, where they don't call them fairies there, but whatever these little entities are, they're the ones that do the same thing. So if it is a real phenomena, and I don't know if it is or not, there are, people say, well, some people say Bigfoot, some people say the fairies. So again, you get these bizarre connections and patterns that may or may not be legitimate.
Right. The one thing, you talked about the connection of between what people are talking about they're seeing and Do you just feel as though that in today's world that what people were calling leprechauns, or what people are saying that are abducting them, grays?
Oh, okay, that's a good point. I tend to think that there's a definite connection, and there's a lot more detail to that, but I'm not suggesting that leprechauns are driving UFOs or flying saucers, or that UFO pilots used to sport little green suits and red hats, 100 years ago. It seems like maybe a third rail, or there's like some commonality that in this phenomena perhaps mask itself or manifest differently in different ways. There's a definite connection there, but I don't know if it's that simple as UFO pilots appearing differently, or simply a matter of perception. I think people, Evans Wentz, who was who researched the stories. He wrote a book called The Fairy Faith of Celtic Countries. It was published about 1911. And he went around and he talked to people one-on-one about their experiences with the little people. Huh. And just as we go along around now and talk to people about their UFO experience or their sighting. So these were one-on-one real experiences time after time with people that claimed, that really believed, and they would have missing time. Just in the same way that Betty and Barney Hill did, only they would be usually whisked away to maybe inside a mountain or an underground kingdom. Sometimes UFO abductees believed they were taken to an underground base or whatever. There are other aspects where sometimes there's a perilous that people talk about being paralyzed when they've seen a couple entities or whatever from a landed craft. Well, perilous was another common thing with the little people. So it seems like there's so many parallels where there's a lot of smoke there. That there must be something to it.
Right. Wow. One of the things you said you had an interest in is like Van Tassel and all the contactees. A lot of them were charlatans that were doing this type of thing, but it's still like a fascination of yours, looking back.
Yes,
into that?
Yes, I think that there may be something to be learned there. George Van Tassel was he's the one that lived under Giant Rock in California, and had those. And I would have loved. Can you imagine what it would have been like to go to those great conventions in California? Now, these were mainly directed toward the contactees, and of course, the contactees were usually, they came out of 47 is when Kenneth Arnold had his sighting. And then in the 50s and 60s, you had a lot of stories about the contacts with the beautiful Space Brothers, the long-haired Venusians, and so forth, and a lot of very dubious stories. But you wonder about some of them, if perhaps there was something really going on. And Van Tassel would have these great conventions at Giant Rock, which catered mostly to the contactees. And if you want a nice definition of what's the difference between a contactee and an abductee is a contactee has a choice and to make contact. The abductee has no choice. They get that unscheduled medical exam with no deductible and no copay. So, but Van Tassel would sit under Giant Rock and he would channel supposedly the Space Brothers, and then there was George Hunt Williamson, who did very much the same thing. George Hunt Williamson was supposedly one of the witnesses to the original George Adamski contact. George Adamski was probably the most famous contactee. They claimed he contacted the Venusian Orthon in the desert back in 52, I think. But it's interesting that, and then you come up to more recent times, not terribly recent, but I don't know if you're familiar with the Law of One books, Ra. It was Carla Ruckart supposedly channeled Ra and other beings, and Don Elkins was the facilitator. And when you analyze a lot of these different alleged contacts to channeling, it does seem like something's really going on. It's not simply a matter of delusion. I think maybe it's being pulled out of the I don't know, the superconscious or whatever. But a lot of the names of the entities keep showing up. There are patterns that, and like Ashtar, that dude shows up everywhere. But so you wonder what's going on. And some of the themes are the same. You get this theme about how, and from different people that don't know each other and generationally apart, that the entities from Orion, those are the bad guys. You don't want to mess with them. But the good guys all come from the Pleiades. A lot of them talk about Meldek, which was the planet supposedly between Mars and Jupiter that blew up somehow and became the asteroid belt. So it's just very interesting to look at some of that stuff.
Yeah, there's some really bizarre takes on the cosmos for sure back then. Do you think I just something I read? It was actually the blog that was written for my website from Charles Lear that just wrote it. He's actually talking about kind of like modern day contactees. I think there's a woman named Mary Bishop. I think that's her name in California. Are you following any of that?
No,
day?
But I know that there are modern day, and some of the cases are almost like hybrids between abduction experiences and contactees. I think you could say the Betty Andreasson contacts investigated by Ray Fowler are I'm not an expert on her by any means, but there are, they still continue to this day, and some people have said that some of these, especially the ones back in the 50s and 60s, may have been some kind of government manipulation. A gentleman named Orfeo Angelucci was one of the other famous contactees that was suggested that he was, again, I have no idea, suggested that he was given LSD or something like that, and some of his experiences were induced. But let me give you another interesting pattern here. Okay. Anne Jeffries in the 1600s, she had talked about these incredible encounters with the little people, very detailed, not just dreamlike, but very realistic. Well, the thing is, she didn't go anywhere. She was in a trance state in her room when all these things happened. Again, this Orfeo Angelucci, he claimed that he had some real contacts where he saw the craft and talked to the entities or whatever, the beautiful space brothers again. But he would go into trances for long periods of time on his couch at home and have more of these incredible experiences with the space brothers. And then recently there was a really fascinating contact case, and another one of these where all kinds of different things happened, from hauntings to shadow people to so forth. And this took place in northeast Wales, and the Sutherland family, Gaynor Sutherland, the one young lady, she and one of her siblings, they were actually talking about, they were put under hypnosis as well, having contact with these odd-looking humanoids, kind of tall and angular-looking, but not like grays or anything like that. But then one time, she had this experience where she felt like she went out of body and went down a tunnel and then talked to these people again and had these long conversations. Well, during that particular incident, her mother had gone upstairs and seen her. She was obviously in some kind of a trance. Her body was rigid. Her arms were by her side. So she was having one of these, in quotes, real experiences, but she didn't go anywhere either. Are you familiar with many of the abduction experiences where people think they were floated through walls, right, or up through the ceiling or whatever? Mm-hmm. Perhaps in some of these, it's a real experience, but they aren't going anywhere. It's all in a mental state somehow, mm-hmm, not something they've necessarily created, but something external, but not physical in the sense of actually being taken up into a UFO.
Right. There's that one case in Manhattan where supposedly people saw someone come out through a wall and go into a craft.
Yes, I think that was a Bud Hopkins investigation.
Right. Wasn't it? Yeah. That's an interesting one. But now there was a particular abduction case you wanted to speak about. Was that the one you just mentioned, or something else?
No. This is one. A young lady, Missy Lamontagne, contacted me almost 2 years ago now, and recently I interviewed her on my show, which is the High Strangeness Factor on Paranormal UK Radio, and we had talked several times over the couple of years. She had this experience where she and her husband was standing. Now she lives in New Hampshire. She was standing. They were standing on the porch early in the morning, seeing these strange lights come over. They live near an airport, but they're very familiar with the traditional, conventional lights of aircraft. And all of a sudden, they noticed that they had been standing next to each other, and now they're apart by across, standing on each side of the porch. And they look up, and they see this large black triangle so low it's brushing the tops of the trees. And and before it even left, this is something that happens in a lot of cases as well. They didn't think anything of it at the time. They just turned around and went back to bed because it was early in the morning. It was later on they realized, what the heck was that? And then she realized that they were missing some time because they didn't realize it before. So what I did was, now she tried to get a breakthrough through regressive hypnosis, but was not successful at that time. So when I talked to her, I asked her several what I call John Keel questions. Now, John Keel had a catchphrase, and he said, ask the experiencer, essentially, what did they have for breakfast? And what he meant was, find out about the individual. And he found that people that were having these experiences were having all kinds of other things going on in their house. Some would actually have encounters by men in black, poltergeist phenomena outbreak in their house, electronic phenomena going crazy, and so forth. So I asked her a series of questions, and I found out that she had experienced shadow people. Both her sons were experiencing orb phenomena. One would see it out his window at night, these orange orbs dancing around. Another one had the orb come in, he was in the house, it came up to him and circled him and then took off. And I asked her, I said, look, this is going to be a strange question, but I knew that sometimes people that, according to Keel anyway, that would have these experiences would have other kinds of experiences. And I said, did you ever see anything like a Bigfoot or some kind of a strange animal? And she said, well, no. And then she said, well, wait a minute. My mother-in-law and sister-in-law, and they saw something near the property, and they described it as a sort of a panther-like creature standing on two legs. It was standing next to a tree. When it saw them, it took off. Some other members of the family saw the same thing at a different time. So the point here is that if I was frozen in my frame of mind in the 1960s, I wouldn't have gone that far to find out the other things that she had experienced. But it turns so. But now later on, this gets weirder. She finally made a breakthrough, and she had I wish I could remember the name of the gentleman. So she was fortunate. She had a really good group come and help her out. But she saw it through her doctor. She did find a psychotherapist that would regress her, and she finally made a breakthrough. And it was classic. Felt like she was taken up into this craft. There were two sort of pale-looking grays to her left. There was a very strange-looking, almost spider-like creature toward her feet that she could just barely describe. But on her right was almost a female presence, very tall and almost angelic. And she was trying to calm her, saying, don't worry, you've been through this before, everything's going to be fine. One thing that struck me, and Joshua Kuchin pointed this out in his book, Thieves in the Night, that the fairy abductions, a lot of times there's the fairy queen, the tall woman, and then the uglier, shorter fairies or whatever in the same area. Whitley Strieber talks about something like this with this tall sort of female presence. I don't know if there's a connection or not, but possibly. So anyway, she was a very, very credible witness, and she's very, very philosophical about it. She takes since she doesn't really remember what happened to her, she takes it with a grain of salt. She doesn't know if it's real or not, but it's very interesting. I'm suggesting to people that when they do their investigation, a friend of mine, Brian Seach, he's primarily a cryptid Bigfoot researcher. He was out in Pennsylvania in an area where people have seen Bigfoot and heard the creature. he saw a classic UFO one night, a strange meandering light that was moving around in unusual patterns. It disappeared, it reappears. So he goes out looking for a Bigfoot and sees a classic UFO. The thing is that it seems like these things are connected, and there's amazing patterns. Rosemary Ellen Guiley is the one that when she was investigating shadow people, she found out that a significant percentage of people that were experiencing these beings or apparitions or whatever were also classic alien abductees. Mm. How do we, what's going on here? One thing I want to say very quickly, while I think there's a very elusive paranormal aspect to a lot of this, and for a time I thought we were dealing with something like a planetary poltergeist, where we weren't really dealing with aliens at all, that perhaps they were, transmogrifications of energy or paraphysical, just temporarily real. I think there's a lot to that. But I also believe that we are certainly dealing with some other intelligence. There are other encounters that are just not easily explained like that. So there seems to be this incredible duality going on, where we do have a real physicality and and perhaps a whole grand central station of different entities out there intermingling with us. But there's also this aspect of human consciousness that is reflective, and some people call it paranormal mimicry. But so anyway, it's another thing I tell people is, you've seen, I'm sure, the original Planet of the Apes with Charlton Heston. Yep. Remember the scene where he's in prison and the gorilla is hosing him down with the water, and he's screaming, "It's a madhouse." That's where I get to sometimes when I'm trying to pull all this together. I want to scream, "It's a madhouse."
Let's see, the group that you were talking about that helped her out. I'm sorry. Is it the Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial and Extraordinary that Ray Hernandez is involved in? Is that the one?
I don't think so. It's a different one, a local in the
I see.
Manchester area. Yeah.
I see.
But she was, like I said, I wish I could remember the name right now, but she was very fortunate to have, you can get, when you seek help for this kind of thing, you don't know who you're going to get,
Yeah.
And I'm not sure. I would be very qualified in certain areas to help people, depending on what the situation is. But she's just fascinating. Talked to her a month or so ago, and she really is an amazing lady.
Yeah, I've questioned too. It seems very peculiar that these people have the same thing happen over and over again, and then in their family lines and all that. It's really bizarre. There's also a lot of commonalities. I think that's what I find the most fascinating part of it. Speaking to people like Kathy Martin and, just the commonalities makes it fascinating, whatever it is that it's happening. And some of it, just like what we're talking about tonight, some of it could be, sleep paralysis.
Oh, sure.
Things like that. It could be something, imagined also, but some people seem pretty devastated by the happenings of it, and it's funny at some of the conferences they have like a group meeting, almost like a group therapy, just to talk among themselves, and it seems to help them.
Well, there are so many mysteries. I mentioned the Greys. The Greys didn't really seem to show up in mass until late 70s, early 80s. Especially with the advent of the Whitley Strieber books. There were some earlier experiences where the entities maybe looked a little bit like a gray. Even the Betty and Barney Hill aliens weren't really grays. It was almost like the grays would have been a sort of a counterfeit of them, or if they were to make a sort of an image of themselves, more like a doll or whatever, it would come out like a gray, because they look quite a bit different. And if you go back in the literature from the late 40s, 50s, 60s, there was a variety of aliens, or whatever you want to call them. Think of the Pascagoula androids, or whatever they were. There are so many of these. A lot of them were actually, if you took away their silver suit and gave them a little red cap and green outfit, would look identical to the fairies. But there was such a variety. I mean, there was the Antonio Villas-Boas lady. There was the so many different types of aliens, and then you wonder, okay, why did it change? Does it mean that literally the Greys were the new kids on the block and aced out most of the other ones, or are we dealing with a perception or a facade, or is something else changing going on? So these things are all worth considering to try and sort through just what is going on.
Right. So you followed this for decades, the whole thing. And what are some of the changes that you've seen that are good, and some of the changes that you've seen are bad?
In investigation techniques, or
in the UFO field? I'm
Okay.
thinking off the top. The internet is like a double-edged sword, and that came along while you were doing your looking into this topic, and a lot's changed since then. Alone.
Well, I think that there's been some pretty good. I went to a UFO contact event in Houghton Lake, Michigan last September. That was a really well done event. Unfortunately, this year it's the same weekend as the Mothman Festival, so I won't be making that. But there are some really good, very positive people out there doing good things, along with all the negative stuff. I think one thing I see is that the people are making the transition, whether they're a Bigfoot researcher, cryptid, UFO, or whatever. They get to a point like John Keel did. Jacques Vallee, he started out as a very nuts and bolts UFO researcher. His first two books, Anatomy of a Phenomena and Challenge to Science. Challenge to Science covered this incredible wave of landings in France in the mid-'50s. And then, he wrote Passport to Magonia. And he says, it's like he hit a brick wall, and he said, look, this is not a scientific book. But people like John Keel started out the same way, nuts and bolts, flying saucers. So people come to a point like I did. I was very happy with ET. And even here's another example. Ron Moorhead, a famous Bigfoot researcher. He's the one that captured the Sierra Sounds in the Sierra Nevadas, which seem to be legitimate Bigfoot recordings. They've been examined by experts. Well, his second book he wrote was called Quantum Bigfoot. He's come to believe that Bigfoot is somehow interdimensional and actually phases in and out somehow. And that, I'm sure, disappointed a lot of the flesh and blood guys. So the one positive thing I see in general is that people are at least a little more open to the possibilities, to the patterns, and seeing that, why is it that, I've talked to people like Stan Gordon and Rosemary Ellen Guiley, and they've told me that they've interviewed people that were interviewed previously by other researchers, and the other researchers would tell them, no, I want to hear about your Bigfoot report. I don't want to hear about the UFO you saw, and vice versa. I don't want to hear about that hairy biped. I want to hear about the craft from Alpha Centauri. So they would find that people weren't ready to look at the possibility that there's some interface somehow. So I guess that's the most positive thing I see, that more and more people. I even know of a gentleman that was looking into the Dogman phenomena, and who was very, very set on a very physical flesh and blood approach, but has started to think, well, maybe there is something that doesn't quite fit that. Maybe there's something else going on.
Interesting. Yeah. I've had Nick. I'm trying to think of his last name right now.
Redfern?
Yeah, on the show a number of times. That's more of his passion than UFOs. He'll write about other things, but the cryptids are fascinating, and boy, he's got some great stories on that.
Well, he covered Loch Ness. He picked up the mantle from Ted Holliday. Ted Holliday wrote some great books on Loch Ness, and he's another one that went through the transition. He thought Nessie was he thought it was when you looked at some of the description, was kind of an oversized slug. And then that was the great Orm of Loch Ness. Okay. Orm was an ancient word. ORM was an ancient word for worm. And then he wrote the Dragon and the Disc, because he found out that Loch Ness was actually a UFO hotspot. there was all kinds of things going on there, and Nessie wasn't really acting like a flesh and blood creature, like something else was going on.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess, as we know, Nessie, the picture, that famous picture, I believe that's been kind of verified that that's a hoax, but I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah, I think so. There was some incredible land sightings that Holliday, this is F.W. Holliday, he corresponded with John Keel, by the way, but there were some bizarre sightings of seeing it on land, and it was slithering more like a giant worm or anything than a plesiosaur. And then Holliday found out that there were other lakes and lochs that had very similar creatures, but they're very small lakes, and the fish population wasn't anywhere near the size it would need to feed one of these creatures, much less a colony. And then there was in Loch Ness in Foyers, is about halfway down the loch, there was a Swedish journalist that was doing a research on Nessie, and he comes across this. He gets lost in the woods, turns around, gets close to the water, and then he sees this thing that he thinks is a submersible, some kind of submarine, and with some divers standing next to it. He gets closer and thinks, uh-oh, something weird about these guys. They're not divers. They get into this craft and it takes off. He goes back to Sweden, and we don't know the details, but he wrote John Keel that when he goes back to write his article, he's plagued by a man in black in somewhere in Stockholm, I guess it was. But and then like I say, Redfern in his latest book on his book has just been reprinted on Loch Ness, talks about how people have seen other things in the loch, like something like a crocodile with tusks, and it's weird because if you go back to the history of Loch Ness, they believed something was in there for centuries, but they called it the Kelpie or the water horse. And what was the Kelpie? It was a shape-shifting evil being of some sort. And the more that even Holliday got into with Dr. Donald Ormond. Dr. Donald Ormond believed that Nessie was evil, so they did an exorcism over the loch, and all kinds of weird stuff happened afterwards. So but again, it was Holliday himself started to see some strange lights in the sky. So we never think of Loch Ness as being a UFO hotspot, but apparently it is or was.
Wow. We have time to take one call. If someone would like to call in, that number is 603-967-4030. And that's a show number only. It's not live during regular hours. It's just live on the show. And we have a whole new system coming on board with a new phone number through KGRA radio. That'll be coming up in a while. I'll talk more about that. It should be really much smoother. So anyone can call in. That line is open. And so we have about 6 or so minutes left. And what do you think, if you are asked this question, what do you think the possibilities of what we are seeing in the skies are, besides, explainable things?
I think that I've come to believe that we are certainly dealing with some other intelligence. You look at the bizarre encounters that occurred in Brazil in the late 70s, early 80s, covered by Robert Pratt and Jacques Vallee, for that matter. There's a real physicality to some of it. I mean, look, if there's one crashed saucer, and a lot of those stories are dubious, then that puts it in the physical. The alien implant aspect doesn't seem like you can easily explain that as a government interference, but I don't know. So it seems like there's this interface between something about human consciousness and some other intelligence. What if this other intelligence is aware of this hypothetical aspect of human consciousness, and can somehow use it and exploit it to sort of mask their activities or to manipulate us? So there's two major things going on, I think.
Wow. Okay, well, we have a caller. Caller, your name and where are you calling from?
Ray Stanford from Maryland.
Ray. Well, Ray's on the phone.
Ray, hi. Hi, how are you, Ray? I saw you speak at the 1976 MUFON Symposium in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
That was a while back. Okay, well, we were both there, I guess. That's
Yes, absolutely.
Great. That's way back. Good memory there. Yeah, I was there. Hey, I thought I would quickly tell an interesting thing related to the Antonio Villas-Boas case, which happened in Brazil, the so-called space rape, where he was induced into intercourse, allegedly, with an alien female. The interesting thing is that I was living in Phoenix that time, and the next day, on Saturday, Jim and Coral Lorenzen of APRO were going to come see me, but I didn't know what they wanted to tell me about. And I had a weird dream the night before they came that a friend and I that was involved in UFO studies with me, Bill Sanford and I, dreamed that we were up on Camelback Mountain and a UFO landed. We approached the side of it, and inside we heard something I'd never thought of in relationship to the objects. Inside we could hear this, these kind of weird sounds. And I thought, that's crazy. Well, I woke up from the dream kind of astonished and made notes of it. Well, in the morning, that afternoon, Jim and Coral Lorenzen of APRO came to visit me. And they said, we have an amazing case. It's never been published. They told me about the Antonio Villas-Boas thing. Well, here's the catch point. Weirdly, they got to the point where he described sounds that he heard these aliens making between each other. And she said, it was exactly what we had heard in the dream inside of the craft. And I don't think that proves anything, but I thought it at least perhaps suggests some kind of premonition, or I don't know. But anyway, I thought you might enjoy hearing this story about something that suggests something related to psi, ESP, or something was going on about a case that we had no knowledge, that I had no knowledge of until Jim and Coral came and told me about it.
Wow.
Wow.
Ray, you have so many great stories. I always love hearing from you.
And especially of the contactees.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. I don't consider myself one of those, but back in the 50s, when we had some amazing experiences, we got classified into that, and for a while I considered myself into it, but we realized there was a much more objective way to interpret the object encounters that we were having. But anyhow, it's nice to talk to you, Steve, and I'd better let you off because I know the show's about to end and let you close up, but I enjoyed speaking and sharing this with you.
Well, a real pleasure, Ray. Nice to talk to you.
Thanks, Steve.
All right, Ray. Take care. All right.
Wow, that was great.
Yeah. He listens to a lot of the shows, and I think you had him right in your bio when you were.
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
I did.
Yeah. So we have just a couple more minutes. Probably not a good idea to take another call at this point. So I was basically asking you what you thought the beings might be, which is just, of course, speculations. It's always good to hear, other people's, thoughts on what might be going on. I still feel as though that, I've done this show now for, oh my goodness, it's coming up on 8 years in the fall. And I feel as though I know probably less than I did when I started, or about the same, I should say. Definitely not an expert. And but anyway, are you available for anyone if someone would like to contact you in any type of way? And
I'm on Facebook, Steve Ward, and they can hear me on Mack Maloney's Military X-Files as a correspondent every week. I'm doing my own show every 2 weeks now on the Paranormal UK Radio Network called the High Strangeness Factor. And that would be great.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, thank you. This has been a lot of fun.
All right. Take care. All right, everyone. So that's it for the show this evening. And thank you so much for listening. Now, I'm pretty excited next week. We have Charlie Foltz. Charlie was one of the 4 from the Allagash abduction case. And he's a great guy. I'm really looking forward to seeing him. I want to thank everyone that helps out with the show. And I want to also thank supporters of this show. I couldn't do it without you. And again, we'll be back next week. And remember to keep your eyes to the sky.